Imagine being tied down naked in the heat of the Roman sun, honey smeared on your body, eyes wide, begging, and then the insects come. Not one or two, but thousands. You scream, but they love that. You suffer, and that's the point. In ancient Rome, execution wasn't punishment. It was a message carved into the flesh of the condemned. And among all their twisted tools of terror, one method was so monstrous, it almost disappeared from history. Rome was built on blood. Not just the blood of soldiers or slaves, but the blood spilled in public squares, on execution hills, and inside roaring arenas. To be Roman was to understand that cruelty wasn't a flaw of power. It was power. The Colosseum, that architectural marvel we admire today, was a furnace for human suffering. 50,000 spectators could pack its stone seats to watch a man be devoured, flayed, stabbed, burned, or butchered. It wasn't just justice, it was entertainment. A man's final breath wasn't mourned, it was applauded, and it wasn't random. Rome executed with purpose. Every act of violence was a message: defy the law, and this will be your fate. The more public the death, the louder that message became. Rebels were crucified by the hundreds, lining the Appian Way like grotesque mile markers. Slaves, gladiators, and traitors died screaming as nobles raised their wine cups, amused. Yet not all executions were public. Some punishments were so vile, so unholy, that Rome dared not put them on display. These were the ones reserved for the condemned, who weren't just to be killed, but erased. These methods weren't designed for the crowd, they were designed for silence. Suffering that happened in the dark, where no audience could cheer, only the condemned could scream, and Rome didn't write about these horrors, not officially. They hid them, buried them in forgotten scrolls, or scribbled whispers in the margins of surviving texts. But fragments remain. And in those fragments is something more terrifying than crucifixion, more grotesque than feeding a man to lions, a punishment so slow, so methodical, so inhuman, that even Roman historians looked away, because it didn't just kill the body, it rotted it, alive, but beyond the screams of the arena and the blood. On the sand, Rome had a secret, a method so horrifying it was hidden from the crowds and buried by history itself. Rome didn't invent cruelty, but it did refine it into an art. Crucifixion, for instance, was so widespread that it became background noise. Rebellious slaves, petty thieves, political enemies, thousands of them were nailed to wood and left to rot. Some crucified upside down, some pierced through the groin or ankles, some left for days to slowly suffocate as their lungs collapsed under their own body weight. Then came damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to wild beasts. Unarmed men, tossed into arenas to be mauled by lions or torn apart by starved dogs. It wasn't justice, it was blood sport. Roman citizens brought their children to watch. Vendors sold snacks as people screamed and died. For more severe crimes, they got inventive. Fire, flaying, dismemberment, boiling, eyes gouged out, tongues cut. There was even the poena culae, a man sewn into a sack with a viper, a monkey, a dog, and a rooster, then hurled into the river. A punishment so symbolic, it was poetry made of flesh. These methods were brutal, but they were meant to be seen. They were warnings, terrifying, yes, but ultimately theatrical. But then there were others, methods not recorded in full, punishments, only hinted at in faded texts and cautious commentary. They weren't performed in amphitheaters, no audience, no applause. These weren't designed to entertain. They were designed to erase, to make the condemned suffer so long, so horrifically, that death was only the final insult, not the punishment itself. Scrolls speak in riddles, a death prolonged by sweetness. Worms fed on him while he breathed. He vanished from within. But no official punishment matches these phrases. Why? Because these methods weren't meant for history books. They were meant for silence. One punishment was never written. in full, only hinted at as if even the writers feared saying it out loud, but those fragments point to something far, far worse. There are no clear laws describing it, no public records announcing its use, no proud inscriptions carved into stone. And yet, it existed. Rome had a punishment so terrifying, so vile, that even the empire, which proudly displayed crucifixions and fed men to lions, dared not speak of it openly. It wasn't officially banned because it was never officially acknowledged. It lived in the shadows, beneath the polished veneer of Roman justice, but fragments of it remain, enough to suggest that this method was real and far worse than anything Rome was willing to admit. Most scholars trace its earliest mention to the reign of Emperor Domitian, a man defined not by madness, but by control. Unlike Caligula's chaotic reign or Nero's flamboyant violence, Domitian's cruelty was cold, systematic, and veiled. He didn't perform executions for applause. He did them quietly, in dark halls and underground rooms where no one could hear the screaming. Under Domitian, enemies of the state didn't just die, they disappeared. Senators, servants, suspected conspirators, gone. Whispers suggest some met ends so brutal, so disgraceful, that their names were erased from history entirely. But in the margins of scrolls, in the footnotes of forbidden correspondence, the horror survives. One scribe noted, "He perished sweetly, yet not in peace." A strange, almost poetic description, hiding something unthinkable beneath metaphor. Another account under Emperor Trajan mentions a manner of death suitable only for those who mocked the gods and insulted the soul of Rome. These were not executions, they were erasures, piecing together scraps from letters, banned commentaries, and censored medical notes. A horrifying image begins to emerge. The condemned was not beaten, whipped, or burned, not at first. Instead, they were comforted, fed with milk and honey, their skin washed, then coated in the same. It sounds merciful, almost sacred, but it was a trap. The milk and honey, we now understand, served a sinister purpose. Internally, the forced feeding triggered vomiting, diarrhea, bloating, and helplessness. Externally, the sweet coating transformed the body into a living magnet for flies, insects, parasites. The man was not merely executed, he was prepared, like a sacrificial offering. But the sacrifice wasn't to a god, it was to nature. No sword struck him, no fire consumed him, no wild animal ended him. Instead, insects did the work, slowly, methodically, in silence. Over days, maybe even weeks, his body was eaten alive, while he remained conscious, rotting from the outside in, drowning in his own filth. And Rome? It said nothing, because this punishment wasn't for the public. It was for those the empire wanted to make disappear without a trace, except for the horror they carried to the grave. This wasn't just torture. It was the art of erasure, and it had no name, no monument, no trial, only a beginning, and that beginning was honey. Its design was elegant in its evil, and it began not with fire or steel, but with sweetness, sweetness that would rot the victim alive from the inside out. It began gently. Unlike most Roman executions that started with whips, chains, or blades, this one started with something soft, something warm, something deceptively kind: milk and honey. The condemned was not dragged into a pit or nailed to a cross. He was not blindfolded or beaten. Instead, he was placed in a quiet chamber, sometimes even beneath the earth, and laid down on a wooden platform, arms and legs unbound, at least at first. There, a thick, warm mixture of milk and honey was brought to him, often in golden or bronze vessels, as if he were a guest at a banquet. But this was no feast. The executioners did not speak. They did not shout or jeer. They poured the mixture into the prisoner's mouth, forcing him to swallow again and again until his body rebelled. He vomited, then he choked, then he cried, but they didn't stop. They kept feeding him until his belly swelled grotesquely and his bowels began to loosen. The sweet liquid, once sacred in Roman ritual and symbolically tied to purity and the gods, became poison through excess. Milk curdled inside him. Honey thickened in his throat. He began to shake from the pain of bloating and cramping. He soiled himself uncontrollably. The very thing that symbolized life had now become an agent of internal collapse. Then came the second part. They undressed him slowly, carefully. Every inch of his skin was exposed to the air, and once again, the honey returned. But this time, it wasn't for his mouth. It was for his skin. Executioners smeared it across his chest, down his legs, over his genitals, behind his ears, between his toes. Nothing was left untouched. The honey was not just a layer. It was thick, sticky, glistening, dripping in the heat. It covered every crevice. The man became a human offering, transformed into a grotesque statue of sweetness and suffering. Why honey? Because it lured life, bees, ants, mosquitoes, and worst of all, flies. They would arrive soon, drawn by the scent, ready to feed, to lay eggs, to turn this man's flesh into a nursery. But the victim didn't know that yet. At this stage, he only knew humiliation. His body betrayed him. He couldn't hold his waist. His breath reeked of curdled milk. His skin felt slick and exposed. He was still alive, but already decaying in spirit. This stage served a vital purpose. It did not kill. It prepared the digestive system to fail, prepared the skin to rot, prepared the body to become food not for beasts, but for creatures far smaller, insects that worked in silence and never stopped once they began. And the worst part, he was awake for all of it. Because this method wasn't about death. Not yet. It was about transformation, turning a man into filth, into a vessel, into something so far removed from humanity that when the true horror began, when the insects came, he would no longer scream for mercy. He would scream only because he was still, capable of sound. This stage lasted hours, sometimes longer. But eventually, once the feeding ended and the honey had dried like varnish on his skin, the executioners would bring the final piece of the puzzle, a box, a coffin, a wooden tomb. And that's where the sweetness became something else entirely. They had stripped him of dignity, strength, and control. Now they would strip him of humanity by sealing him into a coffin that would become his living grave. He was no longer a man. He was a swollen, bloated, trembling mass of flesh, soaked in sweat, dripping in honey, moaning through cracked lips. His stomach groaned with curdled milk and sickness. His skin stuck to everything. Flies had already begun to land. A few, then a dozen, then more. That's when they brought out the box. It wasn't ornate. No carvings, no markings. Just rough, splintered wood, about the size of a canoe, hollowed out to fit a man in the fetal position. But he wouldn't be allowed to curl. No, his body was kept rigid, limbs bound tightly with rope, not to immobilize him completely, but to leave parts of him exposed, the head, the hands, the feet, and sometimes the genitals, left just outside the coffin's edges. It was deliberate. He was slid into the cavity slowly, the sticky sound of his skin against the dry wood echoing in the chamber. Every movement scraped, every breath labored. The interior was just wide enough to prevent panic-induced thrashing, but not wide enough for comfort. He could feel the walls against his sides. He could barely shift his hips. There was no standing, no turning, no escape, and then they sealed the lid. Almost. A gap remained, not to offer mercy, but to invite nature. The same honey that had clung to him in the open air now began to ferment in the heat. Within minutes, the insects returned. In waves, mosquitoes bit, ants crawled, and the flies did more than feed. They nested. The exposed parts of his body became incubators, the ears first, then the soft folds of his flesh, underneath his fingernails, in the corners of his eyes. Flies don't wait, they don't hesitate. They lay eggs within minutes, and those eggs hatch quickly, maggots follow. This was no longer about discomfort. It was the beginning of a war on the body, and the victim couldn't move enough to fight back. He screamed, but only briefly, because deep inside the box, his voice had nowhere to go. The sound bounced off wood, absorbed into the rot, heard by no one. No guards remained. No witnesses stood nearby. Once the box was closed, the process had begun, and there was nothing more to see. What made this part so insidious wasn't the pain, it was the stillness. Hours passed, then days. The man did not die quickly. His internal organs, wrecked by milk and honey, continued to leak. His own waste pooled beneath him. His skin blistered. The box became an oven, heated by the sun, thick with the stench of sweetened rot. The maggots began to feed. They didn't wait until he was dead. They preferred him alive. The sensation was not sharp like a sword or spear. It was crawling, tingling, itching, then boring, tunneling. As they devoured his soft tissues, laid new eggs in his wounds, and spread deeper into his flesh, the line between body and decay blurred. And through it all, he remained conscious, alive, trapped. The box didn't kill him, it transformed him from man to meat, from flesh to feast, from human to horror. This was the second phase of Rome's cruelest punishment, and it had no audience, no applause, no end in sight, only time and rot. The real execution didn't start when they locked the coffin. It started when the first fly laid its eggs in his flesh. And then the monsters were born. Inside the box, there was no such thing as time. There were no clocks, no sky, no shadows shifting across the ground. The man had no way to measure the passing hours, no way to know if it had been 1 day or 10. All he had were sensations, and those were getting worse. At first it was heat, the kind that pressed down on him like a smothering hand. The sun baked the wooden coffin until the air inside thickened. Sweat rolled off his honey-slicked skin and pooled beneath his body. But the sweat didn't cool him. It stuck to the filth and the honey and the waste, turning him into something unrecognizable, a breathing swamp of rot and syrup. Then came thirst. His tongue swelled. His lips cracked open like broken earth. His throat burned. He would have given anything for water, a sip, a drop, even a rain-soaked cloth. Instead, he choked on the sour remnants of milk and bile curdling inside his gut. His stomach swelled with gas. His bowels emptied without control. The liquid beneath him grew, darker, thicker, and unbearable to smell, but none of it compared to the insects. At first, they were just a nuisance. Flies buzzing near his ears, mosquitoes biting the exposed skin. He tried to twitch, shake, flinch, anything to get them off, but the box was too tight. Movement was a luxury he no longer had. Then the flies began to settle. Then they laid eggs. The first maggots felt like pinpricks, tickling, moving. By the second day, they were chewing. They burrowed into the softest places, the eyelids, the lips, the folds of the groin. They hatched in the corners of his mouth, fed on the skin between his toes, slipped inside open pores and old wounds. They filled his ears, crawled beneath his fingernails, swarmed his genitals in sticky layers. Every inch of him became a meal. The pain wasn't sharp, not like a sword. It was alive. It was a moving, biting, gnawing kind of suffering, constant, inescapable. He screamed until his voice gave out. Then he whispered. Then he whimpered. Eventually, he made no sound at all, and the silence was worse. In the quiet, his mind started to unravel. Deprived of light, of food, of human contact, his thoughts looped like a broken hymn. He talked to himself, then to the box, then to the maggots. He asked them questions. He begged them for forgiveness. He cursed them like they were gods. Sometimes he thought he heard footsteps outside, a voice calling his name, a door unlocking, but nothing ever came. The wood stayed, closed. The insects stayed near. He hallucinated his mother's hands brushing his forehead, a friend laughing in the distance, a soldier raising a sword to end it all. But when his eyes fluttered open, there was only the wooden lid above him, sweating with condensation, blackened with rot. At one point, he tried to bite into his own hand. He wanted to feel something he could control, but his teeth had loosened. His jaw was too weak. He cried when he realized he couldn't even hurt himself properly. His body was dying, but piece by piece. Not all at once. His skin peeled in sheets. His flesh turned soft. His joints stiffened, then liquefied. But his heart still beat, faint, sluggish, unwilling to stop. Even his eyes rebelled. Infection clouded them. One became completely sealed by swelling. The other could still blink, but only just. He no longer knew what day it was, what crime he had committed, or whether he was even alive, but somehow he was. He had become a thing, a half-living corpse inside a prison designed not to kill, but to erase, to turn man into meat, and thought into madness. When the box was eventually opened, if it ever was, the people who looked inside would not see a man. They would see a warning, and even they would look away. He begged for death. But death wasn't coming, because in this method, suffering wasn't the means, it was the goal, and Rome kept it all a secret. Rome was never ashamed of its violence. Crucifixions lined roads like scarecrows. Executions in the Colosseum were celebrated like holy festivals. Death wasn't hidden. It was highlighted. It was power, turned into a performance. It warned the disobedient, entertained the loyal, and reminded everyone who ruled the world. But not this. This punishment, the coffin, the honey, the insects, was never announced in public. It was never carved into stone, never recorded on scrolls read aloud. In the Forum, there were no statues of it, no artist dared paint it, and that silence was intentional, because this wasn't a punishment Rome could afford to glorify. This was too cruel, even for them. There are only scattered references in ancient texts, always vague, always metaphorical. A letter from a Roman physician describes a body transformed by nature into a soup of breath and rot. A Stoic philosopher laments a man stripped not only of his life, but of the right to be seen dying. A court official mentions the judgment that no tongue should name. In every account, the details are missing, cut off, veiled, silenced. Why? Because this method did something Rome feared more than rebellion. It exposed intimacy in suffering. Rome's violence had always been performative. Executions were scripted acts of dominance. They reinforced the state's authority, but this punishment, this was different. It was hidden, private. It didn't terrify the crowd. It corrupted the soul of the empire. Even senators, men who watched beheadings like dinner theater, refused to speak of it. Some historians believe the method was used only a handful of times, reserved for the most hated enemies of the emperor. Others claim it was a quiet experiment in total domination, a test of how far the human body and mind could be pushed before even death gave up. Domitian, the emperor most associated with its origin, ruled through secrecy. His punishments weren't loud, they were disappearances. He turned public fear into private horror. When he was assassinated, many of his darker practices were erased, his decrees rolled back, his name scratched from monuments. And among the crimes buried with him was this: later rulers avoided it entirely, not because they were more merciful, but because they feared what it revealed. Rome could celebrate a crucifixion, but what would it mean if they celebrated this? A punishment where the body rotted before death, where screams went unheard, where A man was consumed alive by time and insects, not for a crowd, not for a warning, but in complete isolation. That wasn't power, that was perversion, and if it became known, if word of it spread, Rome's image as a mighty and righteous empire would fracture. The gods themselves, the Senate feared, might turn their backs. So they erased it. They ordered. The scrolls burned. They punished writers who referenced it too directly. They destroyed whatever physical tools had been crafted for the act, the boxes, the bindings, the underground chambers where the condemned had once screamed. It was a cover-up on an imperial scale, and yet the memory survived, because fear lingers in corners that fire can't reach. Some scribes kept fragments. Some physicians wrote in code. Some philosophers, too disturbed to forget, tried to make sense of the horror through metaphor. And in the back alleys of Rome, in the slave quarters, in the whispers between soldiers who had once served in the palace, the story lived on, not as lore, as legend, as the tale of a man who was sweetened like a sacrificial dessert and fed to the filth of the earth, as the method too cruel even for an empire built on cruelty. And here lies the final irony. Rome erased the punishment not because it failed, but because it worked too well. It didn't just destroy the victim, it infected the witnesses. It haunted the executioners. It planted something inside the Roman conscience that no monument could clean. It proved that even power has limits. Lines that once crossed leave. Scars that can't be explained. So they buried it, deep but not deep enough. Yet despite the silence, one story survived. One man whose agony slipped through the cracks of history, so vivid it still haunts the ruins of the empire. They say his name was Mithras. It was likely not his real name, but a nickname whispered in later centuries by those who told his story in hushed tones. A condemned man, a traitor, a thief. No one could quite agree. What they did agree on was how he died, because Mithras didn't die like the others. His end was not written in stone, but in scraps, scribbled notes in the margins of a scroll, a physician's morbid observation, a philosopher's cryptic reflection. Together, they form a fragmented portrait of the man who may have endured Rome's most horrifying punishment. And while the details are unclear, we can imagine his final days. And in imagining them, we come closer to the truth. They brought me to the chamber in silence. I was already weak, beaten, starved, but still breathing. I expected the lash, the sword, or the stake. But instead they bathed me, not cold, not rough. Warm water, gentle hands, like I was being prepared for something sacred. Then they fed me, milk and honey. At first it tasted good. It filled my aching stomach. I drank and drank, desperate for more, but it didn't stop. Even when I gagged, even when I vomited, they held my head still, poured it down my throat until I couldn't breathe. Then came the ropes, then the box, then the silence. I remember the sound of the lid closing, a wooden echo that swallowed all other noise. I was trapped. Only my face, hands, and feet remained exposed. I thought they'd forgotten me, but then came the flies. They buzzed first, landed lightly. I laughed at them. I thought they were a joke compared to Roman steel. I was wrong. They laid eggs in my ears, in my nose, in the corners of my eyes. The honey on my skin fermented. The milk in my gut rotted. My bowels let go, and the stench invited more guests. Ants, beetles, mosquitoes. And worst of all, the worms. The little white ones that came from nowhere. They were born in me. At night, I dreamed I was being swallowed by the earth. During the day, I prayed for the dreams to return. I tried to remember my mother's voice. I tried to sing, but my tongue had swollen. My mouth cracked. My voice turned to gurgles. The maggots squirmed beneath my skin. I could feel them moving. I begged them to stop. I cried until I could no longer cry. Then I smiled. Then I laughed. Then I forgot what my name was. Maybe it was Mithras. Maybe it was nothing. time blurred, my skin sloughed off like wet cloth, my eyes sealed shut, my legs went numb. I tried to count the seconds, the hours, the days, but all I could count were the crawling things. I wasn't dying, I was becoming. Later accounts say his body was discovered by a physician summoned by a curious nobleman. The coffin had not been opened in over a week. What they found inside was barely human, a swollen, half-liquefied corpse covered in larvae, bones still intact, flesh reduced to jelly. But the most chilling note, his heart was faint, but still beating. No one knows if Mithras was truly alive when they opened the box. Some believe he died hours before. Others say he was conscious to the end, his mind shattered, his voice long gone. Some claim his final breath was a sigh, not of relief, but of release. What's clear is this: his death was not meant to be recorded, and yet it was, not in monuments but in whispers, in hidden letters, in the nightmares of those who saw what became of him. He was the one case that couldn't be erased, the one victim whose suffering could not be buried quietly, because in Mithras, Rome saw its own reflection, the power not to rule but to obliterate, to turn man into memory. His final scream echoed into nothing. After him, the punishment vanished, or so they thought, because Rome didn't bury it out of mercy, they buried it out of fear. Rome didn't end the punishment out of conscience, it ended it out of fear. After Mithras, after the story that refused to stay buried, something changed in the halls of power. The empire that once celebrated cruelty realized it had created something it could not control. The punishment had worked too well. It didn't just destroy the victim. It left a shadow on everyone who knew it had been used. Even Rome had limits. Following Domitian's death, his darker practices were quietly dismantled, his edicts reversed, his images torn down. The Senate, desperate to cleanse the empire's soul, passed symbolic motions to restore Roman dignity, but no law specifically banned the honeybox execution. It wasn't debated, it wasn't even mentioned by name. That's because no one wanted to admit it had existed at all. Rome didn't write history for accuracy, it wrote history for survival. The truth of this punishment was dangerous because it didn't just show Rome's strength, it exposed its sickness. It proved the state could go beyond law and order and invent a suffering so cruel, even the gods might turn their eyes. So they buried it. Records that mentioned it were censored. Scrolls with graphic details were burned or locked away in underground vaults, never to be copied. Scholars who tried to speak of it were silenced or discredited. Physicians who referenced it in clinical texts began to redact their own findings. Some pages were torn out. Others were scratched clean with pumice. In rare moments, you can still find traces, half a sentence in a condemned philosopher's writings or a scribbled note on the back of a military ledger, but nothing complete, nothing official. The method had become unmentionable, but not forgotten. Whispers remained among the lower classes. Soldiers who once served in Domitian's palace passed on stories in hushed voices. Slaves told each other legends. Foreign ambassadors returned to their own lands with rumors about the Roman punishment of worms and honey. The story morphed, changed shape. Some versions said the victim was sealed in a bronze bull. Others claimed wild animals were forced to lick the honey off the skin until the flesh peeled away. But always the core remained. A man made helpless, rotting alive inside a box, while Rome pretended it never happened. Later emperors understood the risk. Hadrian, known for his humanism, issued reforms to limit public executions. Antoninus Pius pushed for more civilized forms of punishment. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, reflected on the corrupting power of cruelty in his meditations. None of them acknowledged the honeybox execution, but their silence was not innocence. It was maintenance. The punishment had not been abolished by law. It had been erased by will, because to bring it back into the light would mean admitting that Rome, the grand, rational, enlightened Rome, had crossed a line so deep, even its own people recoiled. What was once a secret had become a stain, a moral poison that lingered in the foundations of the empire. There is no museum display for this punishment, no carved plaque bearing the names of those who suffered it. Rome preferred to remember its cruelty in marble, heroic death, noble sacrifice, victorious generals. But this was a mirror it couldn't look into. And yet, centuries later, the story survives. Not because Rome wanted it to, but because horror like this cannot stay buried forever. It seeps through cracks, it infects memory. It resurfaces in the imaginations of those who hear fragments and wonder, could this really have happened? The answer, yes. Not only could it have happened, it did. And the silence surrounding it is proof of how real and how dangerous it truly was, because history doesn't bury the lies. It buries the truths it's too afraid to carry. But we remember, we dig, we ask what they tried to hide. Because if this was only one execution method, what else did ancient Rome imagine and conceal? The empire is gone, its temples lie in ruin, its statues worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Its emperors are dust, their names reduced to pages in textbooks. The Colosseum stands, yes, but silent now. Empty, no lions, no slaves, no screaming, and yet some things survive, because Rome didn't just leave behind aqueducts and arches. It left behind ideas, systems, blueprints, and among them, buried beneath the marble and the myths, are the shadows of its cruelty. That punishment, the one they tried to erase, the honey, the milk, the box, it didn't disappear completely. It evolved. Its spirit migrated into other cultures, other times, other hands. You can find it in the stories of medieval torture chambers, in whispered accounts of ancient Persia's own variant known as scaphism. You can find it in the files of totalitarian regimes, in black sites and secret prisons, where silence is part of the suffering. Because cruelty doesn't die, it adapts. What Rome discovered, what it perfected, wasn't just a method of execution. It was a psychological formula. They learned how to destroy a person completely, not just kill them, but isolate them, reduce them, rot them alive, until there was nothing left to recognize. No body, no story, no trace. That level of control, that ability to erase a human being as if they were never born, that's a kind of power that still tempts rulers today, and that's what Rome truly left behind. The punishment you've heard about wasn't written into law because it didn't need to be. It was something darker, a template for how an empire or any system can turn justice into horror under the guise of order. The tools change, the names change, but the blueprint remains, even now, when someone disappears in a cell and no one hears them scream, when suffering is calculated, not chaotic, when governments decide who gets remembered and who gets erased. That's not modern evil, that's Roman thinking. And perhaps the most terrifying truth is this: the punishment worked. It didn't just torture the victim, it terrified the future. It forced history itself to look away. Rome, the empire that celebrated its every conquest in stone and fire, could not bear to speak this one truth out loud, because it wasn't strength, it was sickness, and even they knew it. That silence, Rome's refusal to memorialize, to document, to own what it created, is more telling than any scroll. Because when even the most powerful civilization in the world is afraid of something it has done, you know you found something that touches the edge of the abyss. Mithras, if that was his name, was one man. But he represents thousands across history who were crushed not for what they did, but for what they symbolized. Dissidents, outsiders, threats to the narrative. Their stories don't make it into textbooks. They aren't sculpted into triumphal arches. They are erased. With the same precision Rome used to create its monuments, it also carved out its silences. But silence is not emptiness, it is evidence. It tells us what was too dangerous to remember and what must never be forgotten. Rome may have fallen, but the ideas it planted about power, obedience, suffering still bloom. They live in institutions, in rituals, in punishments that don't look like boxes of honey but serve the same purpose: to strip a person of voice, dignity, and presence, to destroy them without leaving a mark. So what did Rome leave behind? A legacy of brilliance, yes, of law, of language, of civilization, but also a lesson that when cruelty is hidden, when systems go silent, when a society stops recording its sins, that is when we are in danger, because the box may be gone, but the design survives. Rome may be ruins now, but the human desire to dominate, to torture, to erase a person slowly, that never crumbled. It just changed its form.